Yeah. Hello, everyone. This is Karthik. I'm from SAP. I'm part of Landscape Operations and Monitoring team. So we have one topic today to discuss about are you using experimental features of safe deployment, which is from SIG. He's PM of release integration team. Over to you, Sai. Just before that, just one thing here. So this call will be recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube, Cloud Foundry's official channel. So please be aware of that in case if I'm sharing some internal information. I just want to let you know that it will be available publicly. So that's all. So over to you, Sai.
Cool. Thank you, Karthik, and thanks for having me here. As Karthik mentioned, just quick intro. I'm Sai. I live in San Francisco. I work for Pivotal, and I manage one of the products I manage is CF deployment, part of the release integration program. So I think Karthik mentioned, I actually wanted to poll the room who's actually using experimental features in your production today. So what I mean experimental features, in CF deployment, there is a folder called operations/experimental, and these are the features that are considered experimental and not production. But I'm curious to hear if any of the operators are using them, and if you're using them, what is the flavor of that? So I'll go. Let's start with Toby, Brian, anyone? It's not Stefan. Anyone can jump in anytime.
Okay, hi, here's Stefan. Maybe some thoughts from our side. So usually we do not use experimental features because when we, let's say, take CF deployment, a new version, we usually do that with the intention to ship it to our live systems. And here we have the clear policy not to ship any non-GA features. So that's why we usually don't take those files. If I remember correctly, there might be situations where we used some of the experimental ops files on dev landscapes just to evaluate a upcoming feature so that we are prepared because it will go live or GA sooner or later, just to get a little bit experience with that and see what's coming up in the future. But normally we do not use those features.
And maybe to add to what Stefan said, I'm not sure, Sai, if you're, let's say, also looking for that type of feedback, but we even like consciously disable certain functionality which is G8, but which we've kind of decided based on certain criteria to not make available in our live landscapes. Like, for example, container-to-container networking was one of these where in scale testing, we actually found out that we could not roll it out to all to our biggest landscapes because it would not scale to the sizes there.
Got it. That's good to know.
Then I guess we've even run in situations where like we decided to disable something and then via CF deployment update we were kind of forced to enable stuff and try and see if we can still kind of hide it from our end users. Not sure, Stefan, do you have the concrete example?
One example that we are currently, let's say, fighting with is route integrity. So I think it's now standard in CF deployment, and here we had switched it off in the past, or not used the experimental ops files, and now as it is merged in, we have written some additional ops files to revert those changes. Here, it's not so much that we don't like the feature, but it's more that we had also issues in the scale landscapes, and so I think there were some doubts about whether there are memory leaks, and there are some tests pending, and we also observed, I think, a higher CF push failure rate during updates, and that's something we wanted to investigate first and understand that it was not during updates, but during CA rotation, right? That's a test we run usually because we had here some issues in the past, and that's why we run a CA rotation test that involves a lot of redeployments, and we don't have it completely error-free, but we observe a certain number of errors, and if that number of errors raises certain thresholds, and we say, let's check deeper. So we put it on the backlog, but we didn't find the time yet to look into that. So eventually we will enable route integrity, but at the moment we did some extra efforts to, let's say, switch it off. So we took the old experimental ops file, I guess, inversed it and applied it, something like that.
Cool. That's good to know. So what the reason I'm pulling that is because before I go into that statement, I guess another question I have is, are there any certain expectations with experimental that needs to be true for you to actually say use it maybe in production? Or that's like the fact that it's an experimental, you would never want to use in production no matter what? Like what are the decision-making criteria you have when it comes to those sort of things?
I mean, one of the biggest decision criteria is if we ship it to production, it means we have to have support for that. So opening bugs, etc., must be a valid thing, and there must be a high chance to get it fixed. Because if we roll it out and say that's a feature that we have in our production landscapes, and customers of our landscapes expect that it's working. And for experimental features, well, that's not the case, or not necessarily the case. And maybe it gets withdrawn because the experiment didn't work well. So then withdrawing a feature from a productive landscape usually leads to a lot of crying. That's why we don't do that. We have an internal landscape, which is actually the biggest one, the Canary landscape. That's something where we could, if something is really interesting and we really want to try it out under, let's say, near production environments, and we would have, with some extra effort, let's say we introduce a feature flag in our configuration to enable this experimental ops file, and then we could say we enable it in our Canary landscape, but don't ship it to the, let's say, real customer-facing landscapes. This internal Canary landscapes, we call it like this. It is from, we have to consider it as a productive landscape because that's the landscape, sorry, where all the other SAP teams are actually developing on it. If that one goes down or has a severe problem, we get a lot of feedback, very immediate.
Just so I understand, what is a Canary? I know Canary is in CF deployment. Is it a Canary environment, as in you validate the new version on it? Is that what I gather?
Okay, so we have here, we first test something in dev landscapes. That's completely dev internal. Then we have a staging environment where we qualify something and take a release decision. And then we roll it out on this internal, we call it Canary landscape, 1 week before we update the live landscapes. But at that point in time, we already assume everything is working, and it's a landscape where, let's say, we check that the update also survives under load.
Because this is actually where all our internal consumers are doing their development work. So everybody writing Cloud Foundry apps is usually using that landscape to
which one is
run
Canary,
their development processes. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So how is that different than staging? Just curious. I know it's
staging is a very small landscape, and we just use it to run tests, so a test cycle. But there's no production load. Nearly nobody is developing on this landscape. While the Canary landscape is from other SAP teams, it's a productive landscape. It has to be up 24/7, and we have all the, let's say, ops processes and bug tracking and monitoring in place.
So it's very close to a production clone, I guess.
Yeah, very close.
Cool. Awesome, thanks
for instance, container networking we have enabled as a beta feature on the Canary landscape, but we haven't rolled it out to live. It was just that some people can get some experience, and we also see if the feature works. But there's no real load on container networking because you have to apply for it, and then we enable, we give the developers the scopes to create policies, and otherwise it's switched off.
I was just about to say what played in favor of kind of even doing a beta for that feature was that you can selectively enable it for a subset of your users. Otherwise, I guess we wouldn't even have gone for doing a beta there. Because like if you make it available and there's still people that come back to us saying, but look here in public Cloud Foundry documentation, I see that internal domain, why can't I use it? But if you just give it out and don't tell anybody, then experience says people will use it in their productive applications and escalate if they don't find that feature being enabled in a live landscape.
Yeah, I think I totally understand that part of it. Like you want to have a clear boundaries to make sure people know how to use features. Awesome. I think anyone else using outside of Stefan and Barn? Anyone else using experimental features on this call? It's 7 people.
Hi. Yeah, so I can jump in and provide a bit of context. I'm Toby. I'm from gov.uk PAS. So we run our Cloud Foundry on behalf of some government departments of the UK government.
Nice.
We do use some experimental ops files, or have in the past, either in production or in user testing. But in the cases in the past where we've looked at the experimental ops files, we've had to do a lot of digging to look at how far along in the roadmap, or how, like, if they're in experimental, but what kind of experimental they are. So, for instance, the recent syslog ops files are in experimental. The syslog forwarder ops files are in experimental, but it's a feature that's going to go into mainline, so it's worth us testing out. Is a good example of one that we would look at in this fashion. Again, internal networking was one that we adopted a bit earlier than when it was introduced fully. The third example, I think, is metric store. We haven't enabled it fully in production, but what we did do is we spent 12 weeks or so last quarter doing user testing on the kind of metrics that it gave us, and whether our users would be interested in those application level metrics.
When you say users, just so is it developers or actual clients who use your applications?
Yes. So when I say users, I mean developers developing applications and services that run on our platform rather than platform developers.
Got it. Testing on the users. Awesome. That's good to know. So I guess, are there any certain expectations like you wish there would, or anything that you wish were true with experimental features in general? While when you go through this process of investigating, making decisions, whether you want to jump on the bandwagon right now before it becomes GA, or wait till it becomes GA. Like what would you felt like? What would you feel like needs to be true?
Yeah. Right now, experimental does feel like a bit of a grab bag of like things you can do, things we will do in the future, and things you probably shouldn't do, but we're putting here anyway. And having additional clarification around which one of those it is would be really helpful, and would probably, as people have already said, increase the adoption of some of the things which are currently marked as experimental. We try and keep as close to the tip of CF deployment as possible, and also add some of the experimental features. But if there were like edge but not experimental, then we might be a little bit more interested in looking at those features, looking at those operations.
When you mean edge, what does that mean?
Yeah, I guess the distinction between like when you're looking at a Linux distribution, right? You'll have like the stable, which is what I kind of use deployment as.
I see.
If you're one point behind CF deployment or 2 points behind CF deployment, you're probably stable. And if you're at tip, you're kind of like the latest version. You'll run into some issues probably, but it'll mostly be fine. And then if you're running tip plus some ops files, then you're like, I guess I would say that's edge or like dev release.
Interesting. I think it made a good point around clarity on which experimental features are planning to go GA versus which don't. I think we have heard that feedback in the past, so which allows not only for external teams but internal teams to test those features, to harden them, whether that's security, whether that's load, whether that's scale, and so on and so forth. So that's good to see, to be true with you as well. I think the reason I'm posing this question is we are having some challenges maintaining the number of ops files in CF deployment, especially the experimental features. And as Toby mentioned, it's a pretty grab bag of things. Before I go any further, anyone else other than Toby and SAP, have feedback for me on experimental before I sort of?
I guess if I'm not mistaken, most of the people are from SAP. So
okay, awesome.
I guess Stefan's feedback covers that part.
That's great. So yeah, as I'm mentioning, we are having some challenges, especially with the experimental features. Once they're added, they stay there forever. So there's no accountability on these things. So what we're planning to introduce is a process where we want to enforce a lifetime or a shelf life for experimental features, and have a clear path to that after that shelf time. So there's an expiry date to these things. So let's assume it's just an example. It doesn't have to be this specific time period. Say after 6 weeks, the experimental feature has 3 paths after it got introduced. Say it either gets promoted to GA, so it becomes part of the manifest. The second option is the feature becomes an optional feature. So that means it gets promoted to the operations folder. So you have the opportunity to add on that feature. The third is that the experimental feature gets removed because you experimented with it, you found that it does not add any value or doesn't work the way it needs to, you just purge it. So this will allow us to maintain a nice, clean set of experimental features and validate them if necessary, and have a path to GA. Right now, we have a very ad hoc way of testing these experimental features within release integration. So, and again, it's a lot of kind of drag on our side to maintain these things because someone comes and asks, "Hey, I'm having this problem with experimental. We have no idea what that means because it's been like 2 years that experimental feature stayed in that folder." So within 6 weeks is a good time because we'll have a fresh context. All the team members will know what it is, including the component teams. So I'm going to pause there and see if that makes sense to you all, and if it does, how does that impact you in terms of your process? Yeah. Toby, probably applies to you more than anyone else here, so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it because you do use some experimental.
Having some clearer cadence around when an ops file is either going to be shelved or promoted would be really useful. I also understand the support burden of having lots of ops files around, and also it's fairly low overhead for an individual operator to say, "Oh well, this ops file is an experimental, but I want it anyway. I'll just put it in my deployment repo." That is definitely a valid expectation that one can have from an operator. Mm-hmm. What I would add to that is, right now, if there's the README in experimental ops files, mm-hmm. And there's also the release notes, which kind of talk a little bit about what the ops file is for. But some of the operations files need a little bit more background. And it would be really good in some of the ops files if there was some documentation inside the ops file, maybe even just a comment saying like, "This is why it is this," which would fit a little bit better than the little table in the README. And then also, like, if you're trying to avoid the burden of having a lot of ops files, the relevant CF team or other team, and how to get in contact with them if you have questions.
So just the last one, I think there was background noise. You mean having the team information, who owns that, with maybe like a Slack channel would helpful? Yeah. Is that what I heard? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. But otherwise, your suggestion or your proposal makes absolute sense, and would definitely add a lot of clarity to the process.
Cool. Yeah, and anyone else from SAP, in case if you want to use experimental features in the future, is that process make sense to you all?
So I would say yes. Maybe 6 weeks would for us be a bit challenging. But okay, if that was just an example, then otherwise it makes sense to have a expiry period for stuff that won't make it into the standard operation files or GA. Makes sense. Otherwise, you end up in a big heap of experimental ops files nobody takes care anymore. So that I can understand that very well.
That's great. I think you asked a very interesting question in terms of timeline. Can I pry on that? Why is 6 weeks? Those 6 weeks is just an example I threw it on the. I'm curious to hear why you believe 6 weeks is challenging. Because I think there's some hidden context I would love to know.
Yeah, so as always, we are also just a team with limited capacity, and we have a certain backlog, which is usually full. And if an experimental feature just comes along, we would need to squeeze it somehow in our normal development work, which is about, let's say, very simple, boring topics like CA rotation or, I don't know, new metrics, or investigate certain instabilities or bugs that we have seen in detail and eats up most of the capacity. So then 6 weeks means for us 3 sprints, and that's probably unrealistic to squeeze an evaluation and a POC. That makes some sense. So it means we have to have at least a pair for a week sitting on such a feature to evaluate it in a meaningful sense. That's why it also depends on the feature. If it's a simple thing, well, then there's no much problem with it. But if it's something bigger, I take always this route integrity as an example. So that one keeps us busy for quite some time, I would say, especially testing it under load. Maybe it really depends on the feature, and maybe the team that provides the experimental feature, maybe they could propose how much stuff is inside in this feature. It's difficult to have here a generic value.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good point, actually, Stefan, because it is feature by feature, right? One feature could mean having to provision, IaaS resources to just have it working, like maybe additional S3 blob stores and so on and so forth. And some feature could just be like, hey, this new field gets added to something, right? It's like there could be a drastic change, and trying to turn on a feature may require a lot of work. So yeah, interesting. Toby, I guess in your situation, what would the ideal timeline be if we had to say, hey, during this time, we will have the shelf life it will be on the shelf for experimental feature?
Yeah, so I definitely agree with Stefan in that 6 weeks for some features would definitely be not enough time. So we don't have an official sprint cadence, but that 6 weeks roughly represents half a quarter, which we would like to have already prioritized some of the work in there. And so for larger features, unless we prioritize it, it would be hard for us to even evaluate. For smaller features, though, like 6 weeks is definitely like ample time to have shipped it to one environment for us and evaluated it. But for larger features, it's a bit more challenging, especially all of the things that have been happening with routing recently. Like, in order for us to kick the tires on it, we require at least a week in order to work out, what, not just how it works theoretically, but how it works in production. A tangential example is we recently ran, not me personally, but a couple of colleagues within the team ran a spike on SUSE SCF. And in order to fully kick the tires on that, and we did leave still a lot of ground uncovered, it took a pair and a half, an entire week to not fully, but to feel like we had a solid outcome and some good feedback and knowledge from that. Yeah, even something as simple as so I'm in the process of evaluating if we can enable keeper lives, which on the go, which is a one parameter change, but does have significant consequences for things running on the platform at scale. And so like it's also hard to predict how much time you're going to need to allocate to an individual feature, because in theory it is simple. In practice, you've got users who have built applications predicated on that weird thing that you're changing. So it is quite hard. The other thing that I'd like to highlight is that the README for the ops files is extremely useful in that it has deprecation and why, and so having some sort of discrete set of change logs either with the CF deployment release cadence or separate to like the operations file lifecycle cadence would be really useful. If you're looking for a feature and there was a deprecated or an ops file that went through an entire cycle and was deprecated for reason, having that context in an accessible place, i.e. I don't have to do git log -s to find out the exact reasoning or why, would be really valuable. Sorry if I'm just giving you lots of
no, this is all good. Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. I'm thinking maybe we have a minimum time, right, for features. Like, okay, 6 weeks is just I'm saying, as for namesake, maybe we may come up with a different number, but like minimum X weeks, and then the feature team can propose, additional time based on how complex is a feature. So there's no max, basically. So they may say, hey, we want to run this for a year because it will take us that much time to get feedback, because it takes about 3 months for teams to actually turn this on, and and we need more data, 3/4 of data, to actually understand if this is actually doing what it needs to do. So that way, we can still do this feature by feature based on the complexity, but and not put operators at what I call force operators to be able to like unwind or wind up based on the timeline. So I think that's probably is a good compromise, like have a minimum and then no max. So what I mean minimum means like it needs to be at least out for X weeks, not be below that. And then they can add additional time. Teams can add additional time.
That sounds good. We do a similar thing with like documentation, like this page has to be reviewed by, and like you can arbitrarily extend it if it's still relevant or there are no changes, or if you still want people to evaluate it.
Awesome. Cool. So that's all I had for that part of it. I do have one small item that I wanted to poll. I think I wanted to have a deeper understanding of upgrade experience. I think I had an opportunity to talk to Stefan during Summit, but I wanted to sort of have this ongoing sort of feedback, maybe on a certain release cadence. So like I said, CF deployment has been released, let's say a major release. Then I send out a poll to the teams, and then they can submit feedback saying, hey, what are the challenges you faced, what you liked about it, what you did not like about it. Oftentimes the feedback is only when I actually go and reach out. So I want to see if I can set up a process. And I think I talked to Swarna about this, but Summit happened and everything else I was traveling. But I want to get back to like having more feedback at a certain cadence. So I'm thinking maybe at every major release or at certain timelines I can ask, just kind of poll the team. Hey, how's it going? What are the recent challenges you had, with upgrade? And that way it gives me the goal for me is to understand the good, the bad, and the ugly with upgrading Cloud Foundry. And I can use that data to shape on how we do upgrades and also share that with different Cloud Foundry teams. So I'm thinking of sending out a survey, via Slack channel. But I'm curious to hear, first of all, do you guys like the idea? The second is, if so, what's the best medium?
I would definitely fill out a survey on behalf of my team and probably circulate with my team as well, or the team of which I'm a member. If you do send out a survey, please add a little bit of free text,
Yes.
so we can provide some like qualitative context, because I'm sure everyone has a slightly different weird pipeline and different ways that their developers contribute to their Cloud Foundry release and development process.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. Any service I send out, it's never going to be binary, right? We are humans, so. SAP guys, you guys like that idea? You want to participate? I'm hoping.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you regard as a, let's say, update problem. I mean, I classify it into two regions. The first one is that we as a, let's say, development team might have some problems or some more work to integrate the new CF release into, let's say, our pipelines, and then the update is rolling without problems. That usually happens when there is a new major release for CF deployments, because we have maybe to adapt some ops files or VAS files, etc. That's all fine. That's all no big problem. Those changes are usually very well described in these pre-announcement doc files, which I really appreciate. And so that's the one bucket. And the second one is, let's say, there are real problems when it comes to updating now the landscapes, and we see some issues. So just recently, or just now, we are experiencing a problem between Cloud Controller and Log Cache. We just communicated a little bit on Slack and opened a bug on that and are still investigating. And these are the real hard problems, because that might even mean for us that we stop now shipping to live landscapes, and that brings us in a situation where we are not able anymore to update CF, which is an issue if the next CVE kicks in, because then it breaks the neck. And that's a situation we try to avoid. So to conveying this feedback, I mean, usually we open immediately a bug on that problem. So the feedback already comes, but maybe collecting that a bit separate is helpful.
Yeah, I think I'm looking mostly, I think that's a great point. I think the feedback, I appreciate you opening up issues too, but oftentimes those issues are team specific. So they go to a certain team. I don't have that visibility. But I think mostly what I'm looking at is patterns, right? So you may have a very specific issue at a certain time period, but like trying to see, hey, the last 6 months you saw each team had this very simple issue where, or an issue that actually every team exhibited, and then the operators had to fix those things. I'm trying to think about an example. It could be high availability, right? Like say push availability. Every team that is shipping has push availability issue. So that is something that we could think about. Okay, we're seeing this consistently across all upgrades in the last 6 months. What can we do to help these teams think about those things, influence them to start paying attention to that? We can enforce it, obviously, because these are all the teams that it's all collaboration, but at least it's a data point and pattern that we can actually use to talk and have a conversation. So yeah, I appreciate that you're opening an issue, but it's just more around like, hey, like on a certain cadence, what is that data? What would the world look like if I had to collect it the next 6 months?
Yeah, no problem with that. And what I would appreciate if you could also include, let's say, the operators of the pivotal web services into this feedback, because actually for the current bug, I would expect that you have that one was reported more often, because it's a very clear update problem. So if the landscape is a bit bigger, you can hardly avoid that, I would say.
Yeah.
I wonder, I'm surprised that there are no other bugs open. Maybe you have other channels, sure.
I think so. I
But,
mean, I think feedback is such a hard thing with enterprise applications in general, right? Because companies, like you said, like there are really only few firms, organizations that try to keep up with latest versions, right? Like you do, and Toby mentioned, like they try to as close as possible, but not everybody. Like we get feedback, someone says like, hey, I'm trying to upgrade to 2.3 and I'm having a cert issue. I'm like, what are you talking about? We hit at 13. So, but yeah, so I think there are people out there. So that kind of feedback is very hard to make actionable. But if you said, hey, I'm at 13, I'm trying to upgrade to, I'm on 11, I'm trying to upgrade to 12, you're a version major behind, but it's still not a bad feedback because the context is still kind of fresh. But yeah, so sometimes some feedback is useless because does not fit into the world that we are in today.
Yeah, makes sense. So such severe update problems, I guess they also somehow stick into our minds. And if the survey would come, I am pretty sure I would be able to remember it and put it in.
Yeah, cool. And as always, you all can reach out to me in person too. It doesn't have to be just one way. Like I think you have my Slack handle on Cloud Foundry, and I'm trying to see. It is at. How do you even get that? Yeah, it's like I think my full name in there, so I should be able to get that. Cool. That's all I had, and I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to me today. Karthik, back to you if you're around.
Hi. Yeah. Hello, sorry. All right. Thank you. So thank you to everyone. We all had a very nice discussion. So this last month in India, it was a festival season, and I was on vacation, so that's why I was not able to reach much people to get some more topics. And thank you very much for Sai to jump in and add the topic for this month call. So hopefully in the coming monthly call, we'll just try to get some more very nice topics to discuss. So that's all from my side. Anybody want to start something more? All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
See you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for hosting. Bye.
All right.